Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining and welcome to this webcast about biofuel bunkering, finding opportunities in the Netherlands. Speakers of today are myself, Bjorn Breckx. I work as Business Development Director at CFP Energy. My focus is on biofuels in the Benelux region and Germany. And we also have Jan Verschoor with us, partner at Breckx. Jan will properly introduce himself in a moment. Purpose of today's webcast is to provide you with insights in the latest regulatory updates, as well as emerging opportunities on biofuel bunkering in the Netherlands. Topics for today are an introduction of CFP Energy, and then Jan will give you an update on European and Dutch climate policy, the current HB system and requirements, FuelEU Maritime and EU ETS1, as well as an outlook for 26 and 27. CFP Energy has a headquarters in London, and we also have 12 offices around Europe. Our office for the ARA region is based in Zwijndrecht, next to Rotterdam. And we also have entities in many other markets, including Spain, France, Italy, Poland, Ireland, and so on. We were founded in 2006 as an environmental commodities trading house, European allowances under ETS. Our EBITDA is 71 million. We serve over 2,000 customers, and we are doing this with 320 employees, but our team is rapidly expanding. Our offering is based on 3 pillars: environmental commodities, like compliance carbon, but also the voluntary carbon markets, structured solutions for risk management, as well as renewable energy certificates. On the power side, we are the largest independent supplier of power and gas in the UK to industrial and commercial customers, but we also offer renewable power purchase agreements, among other solutions. And on the fuel side, most relevant to you is our offering of biofuels and feedstocks, mainly in Benelux, Germany, and France. We serve over 2,000 customers. There are many household names, including Siemens, Pirelli, ExxonMobil, Volkswagen, but also BP. In France, we supply all fuel stations of Intermarché with biofuels. And we are also serving customers like Solvay or Veolia. On the biofuels and feedstock side, so our trading and distribution team consists of 11 colleagues, paper and physical traders, as well as an operations team. Our volume exceeded 100 kilotons in 24. That's around 50 Olympic swimming pools of biodiesel. And currently we have 4 storage tanks in the ARA region, but we are negotiating additional tanks to support our business growth. I will now hand over to Jan Verschoor to give us an update on the legislation as well as opportunities for biofuels bunkering. Thanks very much. Over to you, Jan.
Thanks, Bjorn, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be with you. My name is Jan Verschoor. I'm a partner at Breckx. Consider myself a regulatory specialist in several markets, amongst others also renewable fuels and especially biofuels, in which I am active since 2014. And Bjorn asked me to provide you with some insights on the Dutch policy for biofuels and renewable fuels. So I will focus today on the climate policy context at EU level and as well national level. Provide you with more insights in the HBE system and requirements. focusing also on maritime shipping and inland waterways. And then I will move on to FuelEU Maritime and ETS1. And I will wrap up with a brief outlook on 2026 and 2027. So to start with the policy context on the European level, trust you are familiar with the climate neutrality goal by 2050. This is also part of the European climate law that sets a legally binding target also of 55% GHG reduction for 2030. And even an interim target for 2040 is now under discussion at EU level. Also important to take note of is the Fit for 55 package, a complete legislative package that addresses many climate measures, and that must add up to a GHG reduction of 55% by 2030. A part of that package was also the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. So looking at some pillars of the European climate policy, there's a strong focus on renewable energy that promotes the use of renewable energy at large. So also wind energy and also a specific policy for transport. There's also another pillar that's more focused on GHG reduction. Also already addressed by Bjorn, the emission trading system. And of course, there are also many other policies, for instance, focusing on energy efficiency. But these are the main policies at EU level that are influencing the Dutch system for the promotion of renewable transport fuels. Then looking on the right-hand side to the national policies, it's important to take note of the climate agreement that's already from some years ago. In 2019, this agreement was reached between government, NGOs, and industry stakeholders, and set some boundary conditions also for the HPE system as we know it today. And I will come back to that later in the presentation. Similar to the European climate law, we also have a climate act at national level, also making the 55% reduction target legally binding at national level. And in order to successfully reach that target in 2023, and quite extensive report was published on additional climate measures that were needed in order to secure the 2030 target, and also resulted in an additional demand for renewable transport fuels that I will explain later on. And lastly, it must be mentioned that we have a government that is quite different from the governments that we had before in the Netherlands, that are more populist orientated, as well as less climate friendly, but still aligning with the agreed climate targets, which is critical for the continuation of the HPE system in the Netherlands and also the outlook towards the future. On a European level, I also want to highlight the main elements from the Renewable Energy Directive that is currently implemented in the Netherlands. So that is the RED2. Later on in the presentation, I will address also the latest changes and the RED 3 that will be implemented in the Netherlands as well. But today, the boundary conditions in the RED 2 are important for the HPE system as we know it in 2025. So there is an overall renewable energy target at EU level agreed of 32% for 2030. But also a renewable energy in transport target that's binding at member state level and agreed at 14%. Important to note is that we also have a harmonized list with feedstocks, the so-called Annex 9 list that is attached to RED 2, and identifies all the materials that are double counting. I will explain double counting also a bit later, as this is an important mechanism under the current HPE system. Also, part A of this list is additionally incentivized by means of a minimum sub-target that must be secured at member state level. And there is a cap introduced on materials that are included in part B of this annex, and used cooking oils are amongst them. And lastly, worthwhile mentioning is a cap on the use of biofuels produced from food and feed crops, and a phase out for high ILUC feedstocks, where palm-based biofuels are now designated as high ILUC feedstocks. Then moving on to the more national boundary conditions set forth in the climate agreement. Important to note in the context of the broader discussion on the use of bio-based feedstocks or biomass in general, that the use of biomass is especially criticized for co-firing for electricity production, but since many years also in the light of the use for transport fuels. But mainly supported for as transitional options for maritime shipping, aviation, and also road transport, and then with a focus on heavy-duty road transport. Also relevant is a maximum contribution that was agreed for biofuels of 65 petajoules. So that was still a steep increase compared to the levels back in the time of the agreement on the climate agreement, but still it was considered a bit odd to set a cap on one of the solutions that adds up to realization of a climate target. That also has to do with the discussion on biomass in general. It was also agreed to introduce a regulatory system that would be based on GHG intensity, so promoting the use of fuels on the basis of their GHG performance. This is not the case until today, but I will address this also later on in the presentation. But this was already agreed in the climate agreement. Then a strong focus for further increased consumption, that it should come from advanced biofuels. Back then not identified as Annex 9A feedstocks, but today advanced biofuels are considered only Annex 9A. And no additional use from biofuels from food and feed crops on top of 2020 consumption levels. And this is also more stringent compared to the boundary conditions in the RED II that I just addressed, that do allow further growth of food and feed crops. And lastly, it was agreed to exclude palm and soy-based biofuels completely from the regulatory system. Then maybe a brief overview of the development of at least the reported share of renewable energy and transport in the Netherlands. These statistics are provided by the Dutch Emissions Authority that oversees the HPE system. And you can see a green line and an orange line. The orange line is the physical share that gradually increases. The green line is also a calculated share that also includes the double counting part of biofuels that are double counted, for instance. So what you can see also from 2022 to 2023 is a slight decrease in the volumes that can be explained by the fact that we have a regulatory system that allows carryover from one year to another. And that it is calculated over a share of the fossil fuels that are consumed in transport. And of course, these are also absolute volumes that can vary from one year to another, and actually decreased also from 2022 to 2023. By the way, there's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, so feel free to ask any questions. In the meantime, I'll be happy to take them. We'll answer the clarifying questions between the blocks. And of course, we also have some time at the end of this webinar to further elaborate on your questions. Moving on to the third part of this webinar, more a technical explanation about how the regulatory system in the Netherlands works. So we named it the HBE system, which is named after the tickets that can be traded in this system, so-called HBE tickets. And basically, what I already explained is that the Dutch Emissions Authority, the NEA, is overseeing this system. So it's a trading system where on the left hand you can see that there is an obligation for fuel suppliers that they can comply with their obligation by means of submitting HBE tickets, and these HBE tickets are generated by means of supply of renewable energy to transport. So these can be freely traded between multiple entities that are part of this system. And I will explain this in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So first, I wanted to start with the demand. So also, so the figure on the left hand on the previous slide, so that there's an annual obligation for fuel suppliers, meaning that they must fulfill a certain share of the total fossil transport fuels that they supply in the Netherlands. To mainly road transport. And the level of the annual obligation is included on the right-hand side. That increases from one year to another. So there are no targets beyond 2030 at this stage. What I already explained is that a fuel supplier can comply by means of HBE tickets. And that does also mean that a fuel supplier does not necessarily need to physically supply renewable energy. It can just acquire the HBE tickets from another entity that might supply renewable energy to transport in the Netherlands. One HBE ticket represents 1 gigajoule of renewable energy, and can be either supplied to road transport, but also to other transport modes. That comes on one of the following slides as well. And the fuel supplier has a digital account in the NEA registry that is designated as the Energy for Transport registry. Yeah, so this is the demand side of the HBE system. Now I will move forward to the supply. So there are entities that can generate HBE tickets to multiple transport sectors, as I already mentioned. Depending if we are looking at biofuels to the feedstocks, there are different ticket types that can be generated. On the top, you can see that there's a advanced ticket, HBEG, that is generated for advanced biofuels that are based on Annex 9 Part A feedstocks. So this refers back to the Renewable Energy Directive as it is today. So this can be either liquid biofuels, but also gaseous biofuels. Then there's a specific ticket type for Annex 9B material, like used cooking oils or tallow, Cat 1 and Cat 2 that are included. Another ticket type for conventional biofuels, as these are designated in the Netherlands, but this is basically a biofuel produced from food and feed crops. And lastly, there's another category for all the other types that also includes RFMBOs, so like green hydrogen, electromobility, as well as feedstocks that are not included in for biofuels that are not included in one of the previous categories, like animal fat category 3, and brown grease is now also part of this category. In order to generate a ticket, the supplier must also hand in proof of sustainability according to one of the approved sustainability systems, where ICC EU is the most dominant one in the Netherlands. I refer to the additional incentive of double counting for certain biofuels. So biofuels produced from Annex 9 materials, so either the HBEG or the HBE9B are rewarded with 2 tickets, so an additional incentive. And this also creates the gap between the physical share of renewable energy supply to transport and the calculated share that I included in one of the introductory slides at the beginning. Resulting from the climate agreement, no tickets can be generated for palm or soy-based biofuels. So these are excluded from an HBE option. And tickets can be generated by also obligated parties, so the ones with the annual obligations, like the larger oil majors, but also companies that do not have an obligation and just for instance, would only supply renewable energy to transport. And also electricity suppliers can generate tickets for the renewable share of electricity that is supplied to transport for EVs, for instance. Then a bit more in depth on apart from the targets that I already included on one of the other slides, also the levels of the sub-target and the caps that are introduced in this system. And the obligated parties must comply with these further requirements. So you can see the targets in the second column, but also a gradually increasing sub-target that is part of the overall target that is also in the graph on the right-hand side is highlighted in green. And furthermore, there's an orange line that identifies a cap, so a maximum on the contribution of Annex 9B materials. This cap is set at 10%, and that was basically the consumption level at the time that RED II kicked in the Netherlands. And we were already far above the share that was a reference share RED II and was established at 1.7%. So in fact, today we are still at about 10% for Annex 9B materials. And then the climate agreement referred to the no further growth for food and feed crops above 2020 consumption levels. And this was calculated at a share of 1.4%. So these are the main, let's say, targets and sub-targets and caps that must be fulfilled by obligated parties. Maybe one comment, what you can see in this graph as well is for the years 2024 and 2025, that this is a sharper increase, and then from 2026 onwards it falls back again. That relates to the IBO climate report that I referred to earlier and that identified additional measures to reach the 2030 target. So based on that report, 2024 and also 2025, the annual obligation was increased, but from 2026 onwards, a complete revision of the regulatory system is expected due to the RED III implementation. So those targets were not increased back then, but this is still the expectation. But this is the explanation why there's a drop from 2025 to 2026. So a bit more into detail on maritime shipping. What we've seen over the past years in the Netherlands is that it has always been possible to generate HBE tickets for renewable fuels supplied to maritime shipping. But a couple of years ago, this really increased and even, let's say, replaced the volumes in road transport at some point. So there was the idea of the government to better control volumes in order to both secure gradual increase in maritime shipping, but also to continue a gradual increase in road transport, for instance. So several measures were taken by the government. Initially, they decided to restrict the possibility of creating tickets to only Annex 9A materials. So it is not possible until today to generate tickets for marine deliveries for other feedstocks than advanced feedstocks. So this is really a restrictive measure. And on top of this, because it still was not controlled in the way the government wanted to control the volumes, on top of this, they decided to introduce a multiplier of 0.4 in order to further disincentivize the bookings to maritime shipping. So this 0.4 multiplier is new since 2024. And even since the year before, it was at 0.8. So we already have some experience with a negative multiplier. And at this stage, the Dutch government is of the opinion that it is in a good balance and better controlled in the way that they wanted to. So these are two main elements for delivering renewable fuels to maritime shipping in the Netherlands today. Furthermore, there are some quite restrictive additional requirements that I wanted to highlight briefly. First of all, you must supply the fuel to the Dutch market. That's of course a sensible requirement, you could say. But there are two options: either release for consumption by the entity that really supplies the fuel, and that means that it can generate a ticket at the time that the excise duty is paid to the authorities. But there's also another option, so-called under suspense of excise duty, and then the booker makes use of a bunker service provider in order to supply the fuel to the end customer, and then a bunker statement must be provided. So this is one important requirement with two options. Then also the sustainability certificate, which I explained already before, the POS must be provided. But on top of this, also it is important to note that the booker must be certified for an AGP location. So that's basically an excise duty point from which the product is supplied and where the booker controls the mass balance. So it's the booker that generates the tickets must also itself control the mass balance. And the mass balance can only be related to renewable fuels. And lastly, in the final delivery, the physical renewable fuel must be, or the renewable fuel must be physically present in that shipment, and sampling and analysis is required for many fuels. And this can be done by means of a C14 test, which is most common in today's practice. This I will not explain in detail, but it's good to mention that the Dutch Emission Authority on their website has multiple examples of booking scenarios where you can see that the different value chains are identified, defining tank storage, so an AGP location, also trucks, delivery trucks, bunker store ships, pedal ships, and of course the customer. And for instance, for every scenario, it is identified who is the booker and who needs to control the mass balance. So if you are interested in this, please visit also the website of the NEA, and they are also quite helpful in answering questions on this. Then I also wanted to briefly touch upon inland waterways, at least that this is clearly distinguished from maritime shipping. That there is no restriction in the HBE type, so all HBE types can be created for deliveries to inland waterways, apart from palm and soy-based biofuels that are completely excluded from the entire HBE system, what I explained. And there's also no multiplier for the delivery to this transport mode. So there can be double counting for double counting feedstocks, but there's nothing similar to the maritime shipping multiplier of 0.4. So that's important. And also the further requirements that I just designate or refer to with maritime shipping on supply to the Dutch market, the sustainability proof that must be delivered, and the physical presence of the fuel is similar to maritime shipping. So these were so far the main elements for the HPE system, how it is designed today, and what are the key requirements, more generally speaking, but also specifically for maritime shipping and inland waterways. So not sure if there are any clarifying questions so far, Bjorn, in the Q&A box, or otherwise I will just proceed.
Yes, Jan. If one HBE is generated, can it be freely traded and used for other deliveries?
Good question. The answer in principle is yes. So as soon as you have, as an entity, as a booking entity, the HBE type will be just designate whether it's an HBE advanced or an HBE 9B. But then it will be, you can freely trade it with other account holders in the NEA registry. But it does not matter whether the ticket is created in maritime shipping or in inland shipping. Doesn't matter for the obligated party. So it is just one HBE type. But it's a good question, and this will be different in the future regulatory system according to how this is designed in the preliminary phase that we are today. So I will come back to this as well and later on in the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Another question, will the HBE change from 26 regarding EREs? But I think
Yes, yeah, that's part of the RED 3 implementation, and that's part of the fifth block in this presentation. So this will be covered.
Thank you. One attendee thought that the road obligation in 26 is 14.4% savings, not 22.
Then we need to go back to the slide. So for 2026, it's still part of this decision-making process on the RED 3 implementation. But looking at the current legislation, this is the target that is part of the requirements.
Thanks very much. Another question, you were talking about Annex 9A. When can residues be accounted as double Dutch counting? What is the main factor making them double Dutch counting, such as Annex 9A?
That's a bit more an in-depth question. So Annex 9A in principle is a harmonized list at EU level. So as long as the POS identifies a material as a material that is included in the annex, it is eligible as a double counting material. But there's an important addition that we need to make here. There's one item on the list that is designated as an industrial waste. That can be interpreted in many different ways, and many varying materials can be included. And we see also differences from member state to member state which material is considered industrial waste under the scope of Annex 9A. On national level, the Dutch government has established a national annex to the legislation. So this is Annex 5 to the Energy for Transport Order, or in Dutch, de Regeling Energie Vervoer. And this is a specific list with all the materials that qualify as industrial waste. So it can be also that a material has been that an application was filed with the NEA to add a material. It could be that this material was rejected, but it is also possible that it's not been assessed yet. So also individual market players can submit a request to the NEA to assess a specific material.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Chapter 4, FuelEU
Yes.
Maritime and EU ETS 1.
So I will explain a bit more on a new EU regulation that came into force and that's effective since this year. FuelEU, the FuelEU Maritime Regulation. Important to note is that this is a regulation that is directly applicable across member states. So it does not require a formal implementation process. If you compare this to the Renewable Energy Directive, this is not a regulation, but a directive. And a directive needs to be completely implemented into national legislation. But this regulation is directly effective. And part of this regulation is that ship operators must gradually reduce the GHG intensity of the fuels that they are using. And you can see the levels, the target levels. You can see them in the figure on the right hand side, looking at the ship. So it's gradually increasing from a -2% target to -80% by 2050. And what's also different, for instance, if you compare this to the HBE system with the targets, it's in the HBE system from 1 year to another year, it always increases. But here, the target remains -2% from 2025 to 2029. And then suddenly from 2030, it's a jump to -6%. And then until 2035, and then it's -14.5%. Of course, this provides much more horizon compared to the RED II that sets a target until 2030. But also the figures or the targets, I must say, will be reviewed from time to time. Not all vessels are included, so there are only the larger vessels that are above 5,000 gross tons calling European ports. Also important if you compare this to the Renewable Energy Directive that only promotes renewables. This FuelEU Maritime Regulation promotes both renewable fuels but also low carbon fuels like LNG. And I must say, looking at food and feed crops for biofuels, these are not incentivized by means of this regulation. You are allowed to use them, but they are not creating an additional value in order to reach your target. There's also monitoring and reporting requirements in terms of GHG emissions for the ship operators. Of course, this is about maritime shipping, and also international voyages are addressed. And in this situation, half of the energy used by such a ship is covered by this regulation. So this kicks in since this year. So it's important to understand that on the one hand, there's the Renewable Energy Directive and the HBE system that creates an obligation for fuel suppliers. And that also deliveries to maritime shipping can generate HBE tickets by fuel suppliers, but that ship operators must comply with FuelEU Maritime. So that's a different entity in the value chain, but the same delivery. So if you would have a biofuel batch, would both generate an HBE ticket and also account under FuelEU Maritime, provided that there's a practical solution that is required, and that requires a proof of compliance. So when you create the HBE ticket, you need to hand in your proof of sustainability. There's only one unique proof of sustainability per delivery. So there must be something else in order to pass on the sustainability claim that you're making from the fuel supplier to the ship operator that later on wants to comply with FuelEU Maritime. Then briefly on the EU ETS, of course, this is set up as a broader emission trading system, focusing also on the larger industry players. but also now extended to maritime shipping and also aviation, for instance, with a specific scope. So now that it is 2025, you can also see on this figure that this will be the first surrounding year for the 2024 emissions that must be reported by the shipping companies. Looking at biofuels and other renewable fuels, these are designated as zero emission in your emission reporting. So herewith also incentivized by EU ETS, as you don't need to hand in any allowances when you use biofuels. Also provided that the biofuel is compliant with the sustainability criteria and an ISCC certification or anything similar. Just a brief check, Bjorn. Any questions in the meantime in the Q&A box before we move to the 2026 and 27 outlook?
If an HB is created, can it be used under ETS?
Yeah, so the same volume can be reported on ETS, but this relates to what I just explained on the proof of compliance. So there are different entities in the value chain that must comply with, on the one hand, the creation of an HBE, that's by the fuel supplier, but the fuel supplier needs a proof of compliance in order to pass on the sustainability to the ship operator that must comply with EU ETS. So a principal decision is taken that it is accountable under both regulatory system, but the practical solution to make this happen and requires a proof of compliance is still not available to my knowledge at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Then a question with regards to FuelEU. How do you envision additionality of Scope 3 for the voluntary market? Some opinions were raised.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to have a final judgment on this, but Scope 3 is a bit outside the scope of FuelEU Maritime, if you would ask me. So what I understand, and maybe Bjorn, from your experience, you can also add here, but there's still the possibility also to further pass on Scope 3 emission reductions on top of the need to comply with FuelEU Maritime.
Okay, thank you.
And this is maybe also when there are more questions in this area, something that CFP Energy can help you with.
Okay, yes, indeed. Happy to take any questions. And after this call, we will also follow up with an email sharing our contact details. So happy to respond to any additional questions. Okay, and I suggest that we move on to the last topic of today, the outlook for the coming years.
Yes, I'll be happy to explain the status of the RED III implementation in the Netherlands. I think that I can say that the Netherlands is quite far ahead compared to other member states in the implementation process. So already a legislative act has been published for consultation, and also lower level legislation. So it's already quite clear what the government intends to do. And this is quite a radical change as well, I must say. And this also results in a completely different system aimed to be introduced as of 2026. First of all, more general remark is that we are moving from an HBE system. So that's based on energy content and expressed as gigajoules or joules, to an GHG intensity-based system where we express it in GHG equivalent, and that must be reduced by fuel supplier. So this is, for instance, a system that we know from Germany as well, and would also result in a shift in terms of incentives for using specific feedstocks and promoting the calculation of actual values in terms of GHG emissions. Then another radical change is that we are moving from one annual obligation for fuel suppliers, mainly addressing road transport, that we are moving to individual sector targets for fuel suppliers, where we designate 4 individual sectors. So we identify land or road transport, inland waterways, maritime shipping, and aviation. And on the right-hand side, you can see the 2030 target levels. So there will also be gradually increasing target levels, but these are the target levels as proposed for 2030. And you see also quite a difference from one sector to another. Where you can see a blue part in the obligation, then this part of the target must be fulfilled by tickets that are generated in that same sector. So for instance, in order to comply with 22.6 GHG reduction in land, you can only use ERE tickets, so the new tickets that are generated in a land. So you cannot use a ticket that is generated for delivery to maritime shipping. So this also answers your earlier question, Bjorn, on how it would work when you interact from one sector to another. So that's for the blue parts. The green parts are free space, as the Dutch government is referring to this, and that means that this part can be fulfilled by deliveries from another sector. And in this, in the graph, you can maybe see that aviation is completely green and completely free space. And that has to do with the regulatory requirements that are part of the ReFuelEU regulation. So that's also a blending obligation for the aviation sector. And that sets a requirement that it's maximum harmonization and that you cannot impose any further restrictions on top of that directly effective regulation for aviation fuel suppliers. So this 5.3% matches about the level of that regulation, but it does not impose an obligation for aviation fuel suppliers. The expectation of the Dutch government is that this target will be fulfilled by volumes generated in aviation resulting from this ReFuelEU regulation. Also, as fourth point important to stress is that there's the feedstock eligibility is defined per transport mode. So it is per target identified whether certain feedstock categories can generate a ticket. And there it is remarkable to see that food and feed crops are only eligible for creating a ticket in land. And for instance, this is food and feed crops cannot generate tickets in inland waterways. And it's also important to see that Annex 9 Part B materials are excluded from the maritime shipping target. While at the same time, the target level is quite high. And also with a further restricted feedstock base, that could make it quite, let's say, the cost of compliance can be quite high for fuel suppliers in maritime shipping, especially when you take in consideration that these target levels are above the levels that I just explained in FuelEU Maritime. So what we see is good news for the demand for renewable fuels, resulting from higher targets. But also you need some more regulatory experts because the new system comes also with additional complexity resulting from all the specific sector targets. Then I want to be brief on the new separated EU ETS scheme. So ETS2, that is designed for cutting the emissions from fuels supplied to road transport and buildings. This will be effective from 2027 onwards and will be equally applied for road transport and buildings across the EU. But it's also possible to opt in additional sectors at member state level. And in the context of today, it is important to mention that inland waterways is announced as an opt-in sector in the Netherlands. in order to further cut GHG emissions, in order to secure our national climate target, but also to keep it enforceable and to secure a level playing field between sectors that use fuels. So that was it from my side. Maybe a few key high-level takeaways. So what you can see is that the national regulations provide good incentives for renewable fuels for both maritime shipping and inland waterways, and that there's more to come. So on top of the existing HPE system as we know it in 2025, additional incentives result from FuelEU Maritime and ETS1. And in 2026, we will have a shakedown and a complete shift in the system resulting from the RED III implementation. Of course, as long as this is all going according to plan. So it still needs to pass Parliament in the Netherlands, but we hope it will be finalized in time. And lastly, an additional incentive comes on top, resulting from ETS2, more focused on road transport and also inland waterways. So thank you for listening in. This was it from my side, and maybe I give it back to you, Bjorn, and to see whether there are some final questions that we can answer or anything else to discuss.
Yes, some questions came in. Why does the Netherlands choose to exclude 9B from maritime?
Interesting question that I raised myself as well. But it has to do with the fact that the RED III, similar to RED II, has a cap on Annex 9B materials and that's calculated over the total fuel pool. So you could basically say that this cap provides some sort of an Annex 9B budget at member state level. And then as a result of the decision to introduce specific sector targets, the Dutch government decided how it wanted to allocate 9B materials to individual sectors. And what they did for the sector land or road transport is that they quite significantly increased the target levels. And in order to make it a bit more cost efficient, they used the maximum potential of Annex 9B materials in the sector land. And that's why it has been basically replaced from maritime shipping to land. That's the explanation of the Dutch government. So if they would add it to maritime shipping, it should be reduced in land.
Thank you. Is there a misunderstanding regarding B30 with the FAME content related? Many people think B30 means 30% FAME content. If you blend with residues, you will have a lower FAME content. Is the C14 test binding for the result? If yes, what is the approximate cost for this test?
To start with the last, I'm not exactly familiar with the costs, but there are some further explanations on the C14 testing on the NEA website, and I think also because that this becomes a bit technical also for me, so I'll be happy to send them over, and if there are any further questions on how this can be calculated, we can answer the question maybe via email.
Yes, and I will also ask our compliance and operations team to respond to that specific question. Okay, one more question, the final question so far, Jan. Why is this number from the RED III implementation in the Netherlands different from FuelEU Maritime?
That's in order to secure the overall transport target and also the national climate target. So we have limited possibilities to reach our 55% reduction target. and also to comply with the overall target of 14.5% GHG reduction that's specifically applying to transport under RED III. So what we basically see is that RED III sets a more ambitious goal compared to FuelEU Maritime. And in contrast to aviation, FuelEU Maritime does not restrict member states to set higher targets for maritime shipping. So this is basically the answer is this is needed to be able to comply with RED III and also the national climate target.
Okay, thanks very much. That's it for today's webcast. Thanks everyone for joining. We will follow up with an email and I will share my contact details. If you have any other questions, concerns, or comments, please reach out. Or if you want to learn more about the solutions that we provide in the ARA region or even in the European region, feel free to contact me. And thanks again. Jan,
Thank you
thanks.
for listening in.
Thanks to you as well, Jan. Stay in touch.